There is a particular kind of morning that most people can't quite explain. You wake up the same way you always have. The light comes through the same window. The coffee smells the same. The sounds of the house or the street outside are familiar, almost rehearsed. And yet, somewhere in the quiet between waking and rising, there is a feeling, thin, almost imperceptible, that something is different. Not wrong, not broken, just different. You might dismiss it. Most people do. You pour your coffee. You move through the motions of the day, and that feeling recedes, folded back into the noise of ordinary life. But it comes back, maybe the next morning, maybe a week later, sitting at a dinner table surrounded by people you've known for years. Suddenly aware of a distance you cannot fully measure. Maybe it arrives while you're driving somewhere you've driven 100 times. And for a moment you can't quite remember why any of it matters the way it used to. That feeling has a name, even if no one ever taught you what to call it. It is the quiet threshold. And if you have ever felt it, even once, then you already know that what I'm about to describe is not abstract. It is not theoretical. It is something you have lived, or are living right now, in the most private and unspoken part of your days. The quiet threshold is not a crisis. I want to say that clearly, because when most people begin to feel it, the first instinct is to search for something wrong. We live in a world that has trained us to believe that discomfort is a signal of failure. That restlessness means something has gone off course. So when life begins to feel subtly altered, when the things that once felt urgent begin to feel distant, when the future that once seemed vivid begins to look hazy, we reach for explanations. We wonder if we are depressed, or burned out, or simply getting old. But the quiet threshold is none of those things. Or rather, it can arrive alongside those things, but it is something else entirely. It is the moment when a human being begins to sense that they are no longer the same person they were, not because something dramatic happened, not because of a single event that divided life into before and after, but because time, the patient and invisible force that it is, has been doing its work. Slowly, carefully, the way water reshapes stone, not in a day, not in a month, but over years of living and choosing and losing and growing, something fundamental has shifted. And one morning, or one quiet evening, or one ordinary Tuesday afternoon, you notice the threshold has been there for a while. You are simply the last to see it. Let me describe what this often looks like in practice, because it rarely announces itself with any kind of clarity. It arrives instead through accumulation, small moments that seem unrelated until, in retrospect, they form a pattern. It often begins with routines. The things you do every day, the rhythms you have built your life around, start to feel different in texture. Not unbearable, not even particularly unpleasant, but heavier, somehow, as if the same actions now carry a weight they didn't used to carry. You do the things you have always done, but you find yourself doing them more mechanically, more quietly, less certain of why they matter. There is a particular quality to this feeling that is hard to describe, but instantly recognizable once you have experienced it. It is not boredom exactly, though it can resemble boredom. It is more like a subtle loosening, the way a thread in a sweater begins to pull free, slowly, at first invisible, then impossible to ignore. Then there is time, the way it moves. Most people who have crossed or are approaching the quiet threshold will tell you, if they are honest, that time now feels genuinely different. Not philosophically different, not intellectually different, but viscerally, physically different. The years move faster, not in a way that feels metaphorical, but in a way that feels startling. You find yourself calculating, 10 years ago, I was doing this. 20 years ago, I was there. And the distance between those numbers and the present moment seems impossibly short for everything that has supposedly happened in between. This is not imagination. This is not nostalgia playing tricks. There is a real psychological basis for this shift in temporal perception, and we will come back to it. But for now, what matters is recognizing the feeling itself. That quiet acceleration of days. That sense that the calendar is moving at a pace you no longer fully control. Friendships change too. Or rather, your relationship to friendships changes. Some people find that connections they maintained for years have become quieter, less urgent, more defined by shared history than by present energy. You may still love these people. You may still be deeply glad they exist in your life, but there is an honesty that begins to emerge, a sense that the version of yourself who built those friendships was, in some meaningful way, a different person. And you are not always sure how to introduce your current self to someone who knew you then. Other friendships may have faded entirely, not through conflict or betrayal, but through the slow divergence of people moving in different directions. This too is part of the threshold, the recognition that not every connection was meant to survive every season of life. And then there are the ambitions, the goals, the version of the future you carried for so long that it began to feel like part of your identity. Some people, standing at the quiet threshold, realize that they no longer feel what they used to feel about these things. The career goal that once seemed electric, the life milestone that once felt essential, these things are still there, but they have lost some of their charge. And this loss of charge can be disorienting, because no one told you that ambition could simply quiet down. That wanting could change its shape without you consciously deciding to let it. Finally, there is solitude. Many people who are approaching or living through this transition find themselves drawn to quiet in a way they weren't before. Not isolation, not withdrawal, but a genuine preference for stillness. For the particular texture of being alone without being lonely. For the sound of a room with no noise in it. This is often mistaken for depression or antisocial behavior or some kind of social anxiety. But in most cases, it is something simpler and more profound. It is the self-making space, carving out silence in which to listen to something it has been trying to say for a long time. Now, why does all of this happen? What is actually taking place, psychologically, when a person stands at the quiet threshold? The honest answer is that this is one of the most studied and least understood territories of adult development. We have mapped childhood with great precision. We understand adolescence reasonably well, but the long middle of adult life, the decades between early ambition and late reflection, remains, in many ways, underexplored. We tend to treat adulthood as a destination rather than a journey, a plateau rather than a continuing process of development. But development does not stop. It simply changes its character. In early adulthood, most people are engaged in what psychologists describe as identity formation, the active, often urgent process of figuring out who you are, what you believe, what you want, and how you want to be seen. This process is driven by external comparison, by social feedback, by the need to establish a self in relation to the world. It is inherently outward-facing. But as we move deeper into adulthood, something shifts. The questions change. The urgency of external validation begins to fade, gradually, and in its place grows a different kind of inquiry. Less about how you appear and more about how you actually feel. Less about achieving the life you thought you wanted and more about understanding the life you are actually living. Erik Erikson, the developmental psychologist who spent much of his career mapping the stages of human life, described midlife as a time defined by the tension between what he called generativity and stagnation. Generativity is the impulse toward meaning, the desire to contribute something lasting, to care for the next generation, to feel that your presence in the world has mattered. Stagnation is its shadow, the feeling of being stuck, of living without purpose, of going through motions without knowing why. Most people at the quiet threshold are somewhere in the tension between these two. They can feel the pull of generativity, the desire for a life that means something, but they haven't yet found the language or the direction for it. And so they stand in that middle space, aware that something is shifting, but unsure what is on the other side. The acceleration of time, too, has a psychological explanation. Research consistently shows that as we age, we tend to have fewer genuinely novel experiences. Early in life, everything is new. Every relationship, every environment, every skill being learned for the first time. Novelty creates memory, and memory creates the sense of time passing slowly and richly. But as we settle into established patterns, as familiarity replaces novelty, days begin to blur together. Weeks pass that leave little trace, and the perception of time accelerates, not because the clock is moving faster, but because we are creating fewer distinct memories to mark its passage. This is why travel, new learning, and genuine change feel so viscerally alive. They reintroduce novelty. They slow time down by filling it with things worth remembering. And the pull toward solitude, that, too, has a deeper explanation. Carl Jung wrote extensively about what he saw as the natural movement inward that characterizes the second half of life. In youth, energy flows outward, toward building, achieving, connecting, proving. But in later life, he believed, the psyche begins to call that energy back, inward, not as a retreat from the world, but as a deepening engagement with the self, with meaning, with questions that cannot be answered from the outside. This is why people at the quiet threshold often find themselves drawn to nature, to quiet practices, to solitude, to art, to questions they had no patience for when they were younger. It is not entropy. It is not giving up. It is the self beginning to ask the questions that actually matter to it. Understanding why these changes happen does not necessarily make them easier to feel. And the emotional landscape of the quiet threshold is worth sitting with honestly, because it is rarely simple. Confusion is often the first and most persistent emotion. Because when life begins to change in this subtle, interior way, there is no obvious cause to point to. There is no event to grieve, no problem to solve, no enemy to name. You simply find yourself feeling differently about the life you have built, and that feeling has no clear address. The confusion can be profound. You wonder if something is wrong with you. You wonder if others feel this way and simply never say so. You wonder if you are doing life correctly, whatever that might mean. There is also nostalgia, but not quite the warm, comfortable kind. This is a more complicated variety. A nostalgia for a version of yourself you can no longer fully access. For the lightness of earlier decades, the uncomplicated ambition, the sense that the future was vast and full of open doors. You don't necessarily want to go back. You are often aware that those earlier years were harder and more uncertain than memory makes them. But there is a tenderness toward them, and a certain grief, quiet and nameless, for the self you were then. And then there is the questioning, the re-examination of decisions that have long since been made and lived with, the career path chosen, the relationships built and lost, the roads not taken, not through regret exactly, but through a growing need to understand the logic of your own life. Why did I become this? What was I reaching for? Is this what I actually wanted, or is this what I believed I was supposed to want? These questions can be destabilizing, particularly for people who have spent decades not asking them, who have been too busy building to stop and evaluate what they were building toward. The threshold brings these questions to the surface, whether or not you feel ready to receive them. There is also a particular kind of loneliness that belongs to this transition. Not the loneliness of being without people, but the loneliness of feeling unseen in your own interior life. The sense that the experience you are having, this quiet, formless, difficult to name experience, is not one that your social world has language for. that the people around you are still speaking the old language, still operating by the old values of achievement and accumulation and forward momentum, while something in you has quietly begun to ask different questions. This loneliness is real, and it is worth naming, because the quiet threshold is, at its core, a profoundly private experience. And privacy, when it is not chosen, but simply the result of having nowhere to speak, can be isolating. And yet, there is something else available here, if you are willing to stay with the experience long enough to find it. Because the quiet threshold, for all the confusion and grief it carries, is also a doorway. Not a crisis, but a crossing. Not an ending, but a particular kind of beginning, the kind that can only arrive once you have lived long, enough to have something real to begin from. The philosopher and psychiatrist Viktor Frankl, writing from the most extreme circumstances imaginable, observed that the search for meaning is not a symptom of distress. It is the most essentially human thing there is. And the moment when that search becomes urgent, when the old meanings no longer satisfy and the new ones have not yet arrived, is not a moment of failure. It is a moment of becoming. The quiet threshold is, in this sense, a moment of becoming. When routines feel heavy, it is often because you have outgrown the reasons you built them. This is not a problem to be solved by changing the routine. It is an invitation to examine the reason, to ask what you are actually building your days toward, and whether that destination still resonates with who you are now, rather than who you were when you first set out. When time feels as though it is accelerating beyond your control, the invitation is to create, deliberately, consciously, more moments worth remembering. To introduce novelty, not for entertainment, but for depth. To choose experiences that will mark the passage of time with something real and present, rather than allowing the weeks to slide past in familiar repetition. When friendships have changed or thinned, the invitation is not to mourn the loss of the past, but to be honest about who you actually are now, and to seek or deepen connections with people who know and value that person. Relationships built on present truth tend to be more sustaining than those built on shared history alone. And when solitude begins to call, the invitation is to answer it, thoughtfully, deliberately, without guilt. To give yourself the quiet that your interior life is asking for. Not endlessly, not at the expense of connection, but enough. Enough to hear the things that can only be heard in stillness. The turning point of the quiet threshold is not a dramatic revelation. It does not arrive with a flash of insight or a clear sense of direction. It arrives more quietly than that, as a gradual willingness to accept that you are no longer the person you were, and that this is not a loss. It is simply the truth of a life that has continued to move and grow and change, the way all living things do. There is a phrase I have come back to many times in thinking about this transition: the permission to arrive. Not the permission to be finished, not the permission to stop growing, but the permission to be honestly, fully present in the life you are actually living, not the life you planned, not the life that others imagined for you, not the life you might have had, the life that is here, now, in all its complexity and imperfection and genuine richness. The quiet threshold is the moment when that permission becomes available, when the scaffolding of old identity begins to loosen, and with it, the possibility emerges of building something new, something more honestly suited to who you have become. So if you are standing at the quiet threshold right now, if you recognized yourself somewhere in what I have described, if the feeling I named at the beginning of this is one you have been carrying, then I want to say something simply, without drama and without false comfort. You are not lost. You are not broken. You are not failing at the project of your own life. You are at a turning point, one that most people reach and many people fear, but one that carries within it a genuine possibility, the possibility of a life lived with greater honesty, greater depth, and greater alignment with who you actually are, rather than who you were supposed to be. The threshold asks something of you. It asks you to slow down long enough to listen, to resist the reflex, to fill the silence with noise, to cover the discomfort with distraction, to answer the question of meaning with busyness. It asks you to sit with what you don't yet know, and to trust that the not knowing is not an emergency. It asks you to be patient with yourself, the way you might be patient with someone you deeply love who is going through something difficult and necessary. Not rushing them through it, not telling them to feel better faster. Simply being present with them as they find their way. And it invites you, gently and without pressure, to consider what it would mean to step forward. Not back, not to reclaim a younger version of yourself, not to return to the clarity and ambition of earlier years, but forward, into the person you are becoming, into a way of living that is shaped by what you have actually learned, rather than what you were once told you should want. There is something that happens on the other side of the quiet threshold that is genuinely difficult to describe to someone who hasn't yet reached it. A certain settling, a quality of presence that is different from contentment and different from resignation. It is something more like alignment, a quiet sense that you are, for the first time in a long time, living from the inside out rather than the outside in. Not every day, not without difficulty. Life does not become simple on the other side of this crossing. But the difficulty has a different quality. It is the difficulty of genuine engagement, rather than the difficulty of performing a life that no longer fits. The morning will come again. The same light through the same window. The same coffee, the same sounds. And there will still be that feeling, that thin, quiet sense that something has changed. But perhaps, with time, it will feel less like an alarm and more like a compass. Less like something wrong and more like something true. You have been changing for a long time. The threshold is simply the moment when you begin to see it clearly. And that seeing is not the end of anything. It is where the real life begins.